what has happened in the United States with the assassination of Charlie Kirk, and it
Hmm.
was somehow everybody was trying to picture him the way that would benefit them. And but
Yes.
when you look at Charlie Kirk and the conflict between the United States and Russia, you've mentioned something different from what we've seen so far. Who was Charlie Kirk for Donald Trump? To Donald Trump and the ongoing conflict between the United States and Russia?
Um, it's a very good question, Nima, and we're going to try and break some new ground. But let me start by pointing out to people that I've been the target of an assassination attempt. I survived because I was rescued by the Moscow police, and the gunmen were arrested and confessed to the entire story. You can read that story in the book that's on the bottom of the screen. So I know what being the target of an assassination is like. And then I also know how the context follows of interpreting whatever had happened to me from the point of view of all sorts of people with an interest in advancing their own views, or wishing I was dead, or being vaguely happy that I survived, and what have you. So context after the death is everything. We can begin by regretting the death of the man, but we have to then understand the context of the man's employment. He was a paid propagandist for the Trump administration, and he said so repeatedly. In fact, one of the few consistencies in Kirk's regular expressions of opinion and then changes of mind, the only, possibly only consistency is what he termed his 100% support for Donald Trump. So let's look at the context in the US, as I understand it, as the evidence becomes clear. And then the context in Russia, where there have been some unusual political reactions to Kirk's assassination, which reflect Kremlin politics in exactly the way you've just expressed it. The Kremlin politics regarding the negotiations with Trump and the end or the settlement or the prosecution of the Ukraine war. So first of all, let's look at the US context for what Kirk was doing and how he's understood. The important thing to emphasize, first of all, is that young voters for Trump last year have been deserting him in far greater numbers and percentages than any other age group. What you do in the White House is you count votes all the time, and you're preoccupied with keeping power and advancing power, not only day by day and in the relation between the White House and the Congress, but ultimately for the midterms, which will decide whether you have a Congress supporting you or not, and then the presidential succession, or, as it's possible, Trump's re-election if he succeeds in achieving and driving himself into succession that's presently constitutionally impossible. So when young voters are losing faith in Trump, it was Kirk's job to rally them and remobilize young voters. That was his job. That's what he thought he was doing. At the same time, you have to look at the way in which his death is being magnified, celebrated by the Trump central administrator, Stephen Miller, the deputy chief of staff, who supervises the two important things: the social media that Trump produces, some of which is written by Miller. You can see which tweets Miller has been involved in. And second, he supervises the militarization, the homeland security operations, which are primarily aimed first at boosting the MAGA constituency of all ages, and second, making sure that the centers of Democratic Party voting can be controlled by military and police means, in other words, by repression, going into next year's election and possibly going into 2028. Militarization is what Stephen Miller represents in the domestic context. And let me read you what he said about Kirk's assassination. And it's a manifesto, if you like, of Kirk as a propagandist for Trump values. He starts, this is Stephen Miller's tweet of September 11. There's an ideology that has been steadily growing in this country, I'm reading it, which hates everything that's good, righteous, and beautiful, and celebrates everything that is warped, twisted, and depraved. It's an ideology at war with family and nature. It's envious, malicious, and soulless. It's an ideology that looks upon the perfect family with bitter rage, and goes on. We see the workings of this ideology in every posting online cheering the evil assassination that cruelly robbed this nation of one of its greatest men. The fate of millions depends upon the defeat of this wicked ideology. The fate of our children, our society, our civilization hinges on it. Now we devote ourselves with love and unyielding determination of finishing the indispensable work to which Charlie bravely devoted his life. Now, that has reminders of two things. One is mobilization of the base, especially the young voters, to a war. He uses that term, war, against an evil ideology. Now, he doesn't call them radical left, or he doesn't call them Democrats, but others do, including President Trump himself. The last time something like this was attempted as part of a militarization, a domestic mobilization against an evil ideology, was the Horst Wessel song. Horst Wessel was a brown shirt, a stormtrooper for the SA in the rise of the Nazi Party. He, in 1929 in Germany, he wrote a song, a hymn against the Reds and against the evil ideology afflicting Germany. He was shot and ultimately died during a dispute over unpaid rent in 1930. And his death became celebrated, particularly by Goebbels, as a propaganda weapon against the left, against the evil ideology consuming Germany. And the Horst Wessel song became an anthem of first of the Nazi Party and then of Nazi Germany until they were defeated in 1945. This, how to say, exploitation as propaganda of a propagandist has happened before. And when you see the way in which Miller and others are using the death as a weapon against their political enemies, you have to be concerned about the comparison with Nazi Germany. It's not just Miller in the White House. For example, Sebastian Gorka, who is a Hungarian British American individual with a senior post in the National Security Council, a committed warfighter against Russia, as is Miller, has celebrated the successor to Kirk in this propaganda operation to keep young people, let's say between 18 and 25 or 30, voting for Trump. Gorka has said, and I'm looking at his tweet, bravo to Ben Shapiro. This was a partner, a committed partner and committed Zionist in the Kirk operation, for picking up Charlie Kirk's Bloody Mike and continue his work across American campuses. Don't care if it's in politics, says Gorka. This Catholic thinks you're a mensch, Ben. A mensch being the Yiddish for a gentleman, a great man. In other words, there is pervasive support for militarizing the domestic context in the United States to keep power for the Trump regime. That's the context in the US, and it has implications for all the wars the US is presently fighting, including the war against Russia. It's not correct that Kirk was, in fact, let's say, a supporter of the settlement of the war in Russia. What is correct is that he took his instructions from Miller and from Trump. He followed what he believed was their line. He's also, it should be understood, in relation to a lot of the speculation about who was benefited from his death abroad, the so-called Israel did it theory. It has to be understood that Kirk was being used and enjoyed being used and was rewarded for being used in multiplying the variety of views the Trump administration wanted to get out where there was ambiguity. Was he pro-Israel or pro-Netanyahu or anti-Israel or anti-Netanyahu? All of the speculation of that kind fails to understand that this man was a paid professional propagandist with a particular mission. And one of those missions was deception, misinformation, disinformation, letting out bits of truth that might not be believed in the context in which he put them. That's the US context. Now let's look at the Russian context, which is extraordinary and simply not discussed outside of Russia. On the one hand, you have a very significant Kremlin figure, Kirill Dmitriev. Kirill Dmitriev's President Putin's negotiator with the United States for business deals to encourage the American companies, encourage people like Stephen Witkoff and Howard Lutnick and Scott Bessent and Stephen Feinberg at the Pentagon, the policy makers making Trump's policy, to persuade them of the big rewards if they go soft on sanctions and they let Russia finish the war on Russian terms. What did Kirill Dmitriev rush to say in social media? Pray for Charlie, he said. Pray for Charlie. The voices of the light will not be silenced. Now, why does a Kremlin official say things like that about a paid propagandist who's often on in favor of putting more pressure on Putin, in favor of giving less arms to the Ukraine? Why does he say it? He said more. He said publicly, so he intends this politically. Kirill Dmitriev says this death has important implications not only in the United States, but outside of the United States. What sort of political message, in what context is he saying it? Well, let me go to what the Foreign Ministry has said. And I'm shuffling papers, so pardon me for while I do this, to get Maria Zakharova, the Foreign Ministry spokesman's words exactly right. What she said was, she was asked at a briefing last week, yesterday you, Ms. Zakharova, provided a comment on the assassination of the conservative activist Charlie Kirk. Do you have an update? Now, the first thing Zakharova said was, we cannot and we will not draw any conclusions before the suspect or the people involved in this crime are found and taken into custody. She's making a perfectly reasonable statement. We don't really know what happened. And this isn't the time in this program to discuss the evidence collected. What the Russian side is saying, we're not going to get into speculation about that. On the other hand, Zakharov is saying, Charlie Kirk's assassinations sparked unprecedented exultation among the Kiev regime supporters. The Ukrainian social media are jubilant. He then goes into an analysis, not of Kirk, not of what he did, not of what he said, not of what he represented, but what the Ukrainian side celebrated in the perception that Kirk was anti-Ukrainian in the current negotiations. Then she ends. This is Zahara. This is the foreign ministry officially saying the reaction to this tragedy has become yet another manifestation of the deeply rooted in the ultra-liberal West, the perception of violence and terror as acceptable means to crack down on dissent. All of that's reasonable, neutral, and it's completely different from Dmitriev. It's avoiding the discussion of Kirk as such and focusing on what the Kiev regime has said. Now, former President Dmitry Medvedev issued a small tweet, and I'm looking for it in my papers. What he said, Medvedev said, was political crimes and assassinations have been carried out lately by a variety of left-wing liberal scum who support Banderite Kiev. Fico, the Prime Minister of Slovakia, Kirk. Who's next? Maybe it's time for the MAGA team to realize that by supporting the Ukraine, they're supporting murderers. That's also relatively neutral towards the context we've just depicted in the United States in a way that Dmitriev was not. Then you get people like Pavel Durov, the owner of Telegram, who wants to advertise Telegram and himself. He says Charlie Kirk's murder threatens freedom of speech around the world. That's an ad for the Telegram. It's an ad for Durov in his conflict with France. He wants to represent himself and Russia's Telegram as freedom of speech. We can argue about whether that's true or not. He's promoting himself. Then Alexander Dugin is a well-known Russian nationalist, Orthodox Christian philosopher in Russia, and he wanted to celebrate Kirk by noting that his assassination date coincides with the Orthodox celebration of the beheading of John the Baptist. And he wants to depict, I won't bother wasting time reading what Dugin has said, as a celebration of traditional values. In other words, projection that Kirk represents in Russia the kind of traditional values that Russia is defending on the Ukraine battlefield. And then there's another voice, Fyodor Lukyanov, who runs a major foreign policy think tank in Moscow, who said, let the ideological war, the holy ideology war now begins. Well, I don't know where Lukyanov was in 1917 or in 1939 or in 1941 or in 45, on and on. The ideology war against Russia is not new. It's hard to believe that he considers that Kirk represents an ideological, a beginning of an ideological war. So what am I trying to sum up? You have a political context in Moscow in which there are pro-American groups trying to persuade Putin to make the concessions that would end the war and return to business as usual. Dmitriev represents that line. Therefore, he's positioned the death of Kirk as an example of first his support for that Republican opportunity, the Trump opportunity to make peace, and makes a mockery of what Russians do understand, the general staff, the intelligence services, the foreign ministry, as the underlying drivers of Trump's war-making policies, including war-making against Russia throughout Europe.